It started like any other day, until my brother-in-law did something that would turn our world upside down. He called my wife out of the blue and asked her to meet for lunch. A simple request, or so it seemed. He said there was something important he needed to discuss with her. When my wife mentioned this to me, she seemed puzzled. "Do you think it's about my sister?" she wondered, furrowing her brow. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants my perspective." I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why was he reaching out to her like this? Sure, he often sent texts about mundane things, family events, kid schedules, but this felt different. Still, we were a tight-knit family, and it wasn't unusual for us to support one another during tough times. "Go find out," I told her, brushing off my unease. My wife agreed, deciding to meet him at a cafe near her office the next day. The morning arrived, and as she prepared for work, she brought it up again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. I reassured her. "It's probably nothing serious. Just listen to what he has to say. If it's something we need to deal with, we'll figure it out together." With that, she went off to meet him, and I tried to shake the knot in my stomach. The cafe was bustling with the usual lunchtime crowd, but my wife seemed to relax in the busy, public setting. She arrived a little early and found a table by the window, keeping an eye out for him. He walked in a few minutes later, but something was off. The man who was always so relaxed, so confident, now looked visibly nervous. They exchanged pleasantries, talking about work, the kids, the usual topics, but it didn't take long before the real reason for his visit became clear. The moment their food arrived, he took a deep breath and began. He started with compliments. "You look beautiful," he said. At first, she thought he was just being polite, but then he didn't stop. He kept going, telling her she had always been the light in his life. He said she made him feel things he'd never felt before. And then, the words came out, trembling, as if they had been waiting years to be said. "It was love at first sight," he confessed. "I've loved you since the moment I first laid eyes on you." He continued, his voice quivering. "If you were mine, I would treat you like the queen you are. I'd give you everything you deserve." My wife was frozen, staring at him, trying to comprehend the words she was hearing. This was the man who had married my sister, the father of their 2 children. And now, here he was, confessing love to her. The floodgates opened. He went on, laying out promises of a life together, talking about how different everything would be. He told her how he'd kept these feelings buried for years, watching her from a distance, feeling that they were meant to be together. She tried to interrupt, but he wouldn't let her. He spoke over her, as if rehearsing this moment for years. This was no sudden outburst, it was a planned confession, carefully constructed. My wife and he had always shared a friendly, casual relationship. He was the fun, easygoing uncle to our kids, the guy who showed up at every family barbecue, every holiday dinner. He texted her often, but it was always about the kids or family plans. There was never anything inappropriate. For all of us, he was a trusted family member, a good guy. So to hear this, to hear what my wife was now telling me, felt like a punch to the gut. My wife couldn't take any more. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as she left. She was shaking as she called me, recounting everything that had just unfolded. And then, the text started. "Apologies. He didn't mean it. He thought it was just infatuation. He was sorry for making her uncomfortable. But the damage was already done." She left work early, her phone buzzing nonstop with his calls and messages. I told her to answer one, to put him on speaker so I could hear. And so, we listened. He was crying, begging her not to tell my sister. "It was a mistake," he pleaded. "I misread the signals. I thought she felt the same way." He went on, telling us that when we were all together that weekend, he thought my wife had flirted with him. That there was a moment alone in our kitchen where he felt a connection. My wife, who is known for her sharp wit, had probably made a joke or two, and now this was how he had interpreted it. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. Then he asked if my wife had told me. Yes, I said, my voice cold, as I listened through the speaker. And then, he started begging me, to. Please, he cried. Keep this between us. The calls continued, him pleading, us listening. My mind was racing, but one question kept echoing through, had he cheated on my sister before? He swore he hadn't, swearing on his children's lives. He insisted it was only my wife, only her. At that point, I was done listening. I told him I wouldn't make any decisions tonight and that I would call him tomorrow. Now, we were left with this mess. Not knowing what to do next. My wife suggested we go to my sister's right away, tell her everything. But the thought of destroying my sister's family. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The weight of the situation is suffocating, and the thought of what this will do to my nieces turns my stomach. The idea of shattering their world, it makes me sick. I know what I should do, the right thing is clear, I have to tell my sister. But what about my wife? It's not her fault, yet I can already feel the resentment building within my family. Even if my sister somehow finds a way to forgive him, and they manage to reconcile, I can't see how things will ever go back to how they were. Not between us. Not with the trust shattered. This has the power to rip my family apart. I could care less about him. He tried to destroy everything. But the rest of my family? I care deeply about them, and this mess is hurting all of us. Update. So, everyone who told me last night that I couldn't wait to tell my sister? You were right. A little after 12 p.m., my phone rang. It was my sister. Her voice was trembling, cracking with emotion. She had something to tell me, and as soon as she said that, my heart dropped to my stomach. What she said next only confirmed my worst fears. My brother-in-law, her husband, had come to her, tearful, claiming that my wife had been the one trying to start an affair with him. He was spinning a story, making her out to be the instigator, trying to shift the blame entirely onto her. It was absurd. I could barely believe my ears. I immediately reassured my sister that it wasn't true. I told her I'd be right there. This wasn't something we could talk about over the phone. It had to be addressed face to face. Hanging up the phone, I felt a rush of urgency. I called my parents. My father was furious. My mother was shocked, but firm. They were both ready to go to my sister's house to be there for her, to offer the support she so clearly needed in that moment. Next, I called my younger brother. He answered, groggy and confused, but as I explained the situation, his alarm turned to concern. He promised he'd come over to stay with our kids, make sure they weren't left alone during all of this. His calm presence would be the only thing that could ease their worry. Meanwhile, my wife was already packing her things, her face drained of color. She could hardly bring herself to move, but she knew this confrontation had to happen. The drive to my sister's house was agonizingly slow. Every second felt like a lifetime. The silence in the car was thick, both of us lost in our own spiraling thoughts. When we finally arrived, the tension hanging in the air was heavier than I could have imagined. There, standing out on the porch, was my sister, and beside her, my brother-in-law. He looked completely defeated. His head hung low, eyes avoiding ours, his posture telling the entire story. He knew. He knew we had the proof. The texts, the voicemails, everything. The truth was undeniable. What was he hoping to achieve by calling my sister in the middle of the night with his lies? Maybe he thought he could get ahead of the story, change the narrative, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. As we walked up, the atmosphere grew even more charged. My wife was trembling beside me, her anger and hurt contained but unmistakable. Without a word, she handed my sister her phone. My sister's hands were steady, but her eyes, those eyes burned with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. She scrolled through the messages, the evidence, her face hardening as each one revealed more of the betrayal. Then came the voicemails. The damning proof. His voice, full of confession, full of regret, and her refusals, clear and sharp. Before anyone could say a word, he broke down. This man, who runs into burning buildings without a second thought, who faces death every day without flinching, was sobbing uncontrollably. His cries were raw, filled with remorse and fear. It was unsettling, almost surreal, to see him reduced to this, broken by his own actions. But my sister? She remained cold, a wall of resolve. There was no softness in her gaze. She'd always been tough, but in this moment, she was unyielding. She waited, silent, her presence more powerful than anything he could say. Finally, when his sobs began to subside, she spoke. "Pack a bag and go," she said, her voice icy. "I can't stand to look at you." He tried to argue. He tried to plead, but it was no use. "Stop," she cut him off. "There's nothing you can say to fix this." With a final look of finality, she turned her back on him, walked over to my wife, and pulled her into a hug. A brief but powerful moment of solidarity between them, two women, standing strong together. Meanwhile, I was left with my brother-in-law, a wreck of a man. His face was red and swollen from crying, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what he had done. His eyes met mine, desperate for some kind of forgiveness or understanding. But I had nothing for him. Nothing but contempt. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice trembling, but I didn't let him finish. "You need to leave," I said firmly, the words cutting through the tension. "This is your mess. You need to deal with it." He nodded, defeated. Slowly, he shuffled inside to pack his things. The rest of the night blurred into a whirlwind of conversations, decisions, and plans. We rallied around my sister, helping her figure out what to do next. How to protect her children from the fallout of all this. My sister was devastated. She turned to my wife, questioning her, asking her why my brother-in-law thought any of this could work. She couldn't understand. Everything in their marriage had seemed normal. Nothing had been amiss. My wife, tears streaming down her face, was just as confused. "There's nothing you haven't seen," she said, voice shaking with emotion. She handed my sister her phone again, and together, they painstakingly combed through the last 2 years of texts. Every one. Every message. Looking for something, anything, that might explain how this had happened. But there was nothing. She's always been full of life, someone who can't help but joke around and tease. It's what draws people to her. She has this playful side that makes her so easy to love, so approachable. My brother-in-law, too, shares that kind of humor, and they've always had this lighthearted banter between them, no harm, just fun. She does the same with my mom and younger brother, it's just her way of interacting, effortlessly. But then, this past weekend, there was a moment that seemed innocent at first but now, looking back, feels off. They were all at our place, and as my wife and brother-in-law reached for the fridge at the same time, they jostled, laughing, each of them eager to be the first to grab what they needed. He let her win, a playful concession. But then, he reached around her waist, his hand slowly moving as he grabbed a beer. My wife admits, in that instant, something about the way he did it felt wrong. It was fleeting, though. She brushed it off, not wanting to make a fuss over something so small. But now, she wonders, was her silence misunderstood? Did it give him the wrong impression? As she tells me this, I can see the uncertainty in her eyes. My sister, however, listens intently, her expression softening with understanding. She knows my wife, knows her well enough to understand that her nature is never an invitation for anything more. "It's not your fault," she reassures her, and my wife nods, grateful but still carrying the weight of that lingering doubt. They keep reading the messages, each one more revealing than the last. It's clear there was no mutual attraction, no hidden signals, no secret flirtation. My wife was just being herself, and my brother-in-law twisted it into something it never was. The realization of this misunderstanding, this nightmare, unfolds in waves of pain. But at least, for now, my sister stands by her, her belief in my wife unshaken. But then the anger starts to build, boiling over. My sister, now determined, goes through his MacBook, hoping to uncover more truths. Her hands shake with urgency, her heart pounding as she types, trying to guess the password. On the third try, she gets in, breathing a sigh of relief before diving into the files, searching for anything that could shed light on what had been happening beneath the surface. It doesn't take long. She finds something that stops her cold. Buried deep within a folder, labeled innocuously, are countless pictures of my wife. They span years, isolated shots, never any group photos, never any candid family moments. Just her. She clicks through them, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. One set catches her eye. It's from a trip to the Caribbean, a rare couple's getaway. My wife, feeling relaxed in the adults-only environment, wore a bikini, a departure from her usual modest swimwear. There were probably 50 photos of her in that bikini, each one taken without her knowledge. My sister's face pales as she scrolls through the images. A creeping horror settles in her chest as the full scope of what she's uncovered hits her. He had been secretly taking these photos for years, collecting them obsessively. The realization that he had been harboring this fixation, lurking in the shadows of family events, sends a chill down her spine. Her voice is barely a whisper. Does this now enter restraining order territory? The horror of what they're dealing with is beyond what any of us could have imagined. This wasn't just inappropriate behavior, it was disturbing. She calls us over, showing us the pictures. My wife gasps, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had no idea that he'd been doing this. No hint of the obsession that had been festering under the surface. My sister's anger shifts, now tempered with a deep sense of betrayal. She begins to talk about next steps, legal action, protection for her kids, and a restraining order. All options that now need to be seriously considered. The man we thought we knew, the one we trusted as a husband, a father, and a brother-in-law, had shown us a side of himself that was dark, twisted. It wasn't just a harmless crush anymore. This had become something insidious. And yet, the nightmare didn't end there. That night, my sister agreed to confront her husband. She had to hear the truth, all of it, and she decided to involve my wife directly, to ensure there would be no half-truths, no lies. They set up a FaceTime call. I stayed off camera, my heart racing as I listened in, my stomach twisted in knots. My sister, ever thorough, recorded the entire conversation. When the call began, the tension was suffocating. My brother-in-law looked like a man broken, his eyes swollen, red-rimmed from crying. He spoke slowly, as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear. It started the day I met her, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It wasn't just a crush. He tried to explain that at first, he thought it was something fleeting, something innocent. But as he spent more time around her, he found himself captivated by her laughter, her kindness, the way she connected with everyone. She wasn't just a pretty face to him. She was someone he admired deeply. His obsession grew over time, a slow, insidious thing. He started finding ways to be near her more often, volunteering to help with family events, texting her about trivial things. At first, he convinced himself it was harmless, but it wasn't. Eventually, he became convinced that she felt the same way. That there was some unspoken connection between them. My sister sat there, her face an unreadable mask of rage and heartbreak. She didn't interrupt him. She let him dig himself deeper with every word. My wife, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, her face pale as the truth sank in. Hearing how long this had been going on, how deep his obsession had run, was almost too much for her to bear. When he finished, the silence was suffocating. Then, my sister's voice cut through the tension, cold and measured. What made you think my wife would leave me for you? Her eyes bore into him, unforgiving. He stammered, trying to explain his delusions, those moments he misinterpreted as signs of mutual attraction. It was too much. My wife and sister exploded, their pent-up anger flooding the room. There was shouting, cursing, raw emotion spilling out. The hurt, the betrayal, the frustration, they all came crashing to the surface. Finally, my wife hung up, her hands shaking. She was upset, not just for herself, but for us. She kept assuring me that it was all in his head, that there had never been any attraction. I believed her. I always had. Even if he found her physically attractive at some point, I knew she would never act on it. She was committed to trust and loyalty, something she made crystal clear from the beginning of our relationship. But this twisted fantasy of his had nearly torn our family apart. It was a delusion that had spiraled into something dangerous. Her words cut through the silence, icy and resolute, cold, never up, her tone leaving no room for any misinterpretation. The finality in her voice echoed as she added, "You'll never see this again." Every word was a weight, heavy with conviction. My wife wasn't playing around. When she speaks of trust, she means it. Once it's broken, it's almost impossible to mend. I sat there, the chaotic scene replaying in my mind, a dizzying loop of disbelief. But as the images swirled, my thoughts inevitably drifted to my brother-in-law. I had always known him to be a bit arrogant, the kind of man who walked with a swagger that screamed confidence. But this was something else entirely. Never in a million years did I imagine he'd ever think so highly of himself. To believe that he could get away with something like this? His delusions were staggering, completely detached from reality. It was as if he saw himself as untouchable, immune to the consequences of his actions. After the initial shock started to fade, I spoke to my sister, and the calmness in her voice was unsettling. She was resolute, there was no question in her mind about what had to be done. She wasn't fighting for her marriage anymore. The battle now was to protect her children from the fallout of my brother-in-law's recklessness. She told me she would be contacting a lawyer first thing Monday morning, determined to see what legal steps could be taken to limit his exposure to the kids. Her goal was clear, shield them from as much of this mess as possible. "My concern is no longer about saving my marriage," she said, her voice as cold and firm as steel. "It's about safeguarding my kids." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I could see in her eyes the depth of her resolve. She wasn't going to let my brother-in-law's actions ruin her family. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more uncomfortable, my brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wanted him back, but because, legally, she couldn't stop him. Despite the mess he had caused, despite the betrayals that cut deep, he had the right to stay in the house until the legal process moved forward. The atmosphere in the house? It was suffocating. A quiet storm of unspoken words and resentful glares filled the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. They were done. And I think he knew it. There was something hollow in his eyes, a recognition that the hope he once had of salvaging their marriage was gone, forever. The lawyer assured my sister that the documentation of my brother-in-law's behavior over the past few days made a strong case for her. The texts, the voicemails, and the disturbing collection of photos painted a clear picture of his obsession and instability. He didn't even seem interested in fighting her on it, almost as if he knew he had already lost. He was too tired, too broken, to put up a fight. My sister? She was different. She wasn't the fragile woman some might think. She was tougher than she looked. Any love she had for him had been crushed by his betrayal. She moved through the house with purpose, her focus unwavering, her mind solely on her children and their future. She didn't seem devastated, she seemed liberated, almost. It was as though she had finally seen the truth and was ready to move forward with her life. As for the kids, they had no idea yet. Children have a way of sensing when something's wrong, but they didn't know the full story. My brother-in-law had always been absent, often pulling double shifts at the fire station. His absence had been a constant in their lives, silent, but ever-present. But now? Once they learn what has happened, everything will change. The stability they once knew, the fractured but familiar presence of both parents, would be shattered. My sister had already prepared for this. She had spoken with a child psychologist, determined to help the kids navigate the questions, the emotions, the confusion that was bound to come. She was ready to step into the role of both mother and father, to be the rock they would need to weather this storm. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law remained in the guest room, a ghost in a house that no longer welcomed him. He moved like a man resigned to his fate, going through the motions but without any real will to fight. It was a sad, pitiful sight, but my sympathy for him was limited. Some of my friends thought there must be more women involved, that someone so obsessive couldn't fixate on just one person. But no, there hadn't been anyone else. It was always my wife, his obsession with her singular and all-consuming. After everything unraveled, my wife blocked his phone number, trying to distance herself from the madness and protect herself from his unwanted advances. But on the very night he returned home, he sent her an email from a new account. It started innocently enough, a seemingly heartfelt apology, but it quickly spiraled into something much darker. He told her he never got to finish his confession at the restaurant, implying there was more he needed to say. And then, the words that followed, endless paragraphs detailing his feelings for her. His obsession spilled out in the form of every little thing he admired about her, her smile, her laugh, the way she interacted with others. It was disturbing, to say the least, to see his obsession laid out so plainly. He spoke of a supposed mutual attraction, insisting there was a palpable sexual tension between them, a tension that existed only in his mind. He had painted a fantasy of their connection, a fantasy that was delusional at best. The email took an even darker turn when he focused on me. He had some pretty low opinions of me, it seemed. He was sure I wasn't satisfying my wife, criticizing everything from my appearance to my demeanor, implying that I was unworthy of her. His words were meant to undermine me, to plant seeds of doubt and insecurity. Reading that email was like being punched in the gut. It was clear now, his obsession with my wife had warped his perception of reality. I wasn't just an obstacle to him, I was the villain, the one who didn't deserve her. Instead of feeling threatened, though, his words only strengthened my resolve to protect my wife and my family. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was just another piece of evidence, another clear sign of how far gone he was. The mix of apology, obsession, and resentment in that email might be what it took to get him permanently removed from the house. As for my wife and me, we're taking it one day at a time. The support from our friends and family has been a lifeline, helping us navigate this surreal nightmare. My wife isn't great, but she's improving. She feels guilty for letting her guard down around my brother-in-law. She's always been cautious with other men. My wife is striking, and male attention is never in short supply, but she had felt safe with him. After all, he was family. She never imagined he'd cross that line. But she and my sister are still on good terms, and there's no resentment there, which is a relief. We will be okay, eventually. But healing takes time.